Hey guys, this is Joe East here. We're going to go over the most popular and the most important business, personal effectiveness, and self-help book in the last 30 years. We're talking about Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Now, if you're trying to go from, say, the working class to the middle class, or say from the lower middle class to the upper middle class, you're going to need to have these 7 habits as a foundation of how you approach the world. It's kind of a very basic stuff, but some of us, of course, need refreshing every once in a while on the basics, right? The fundamentals. So it was published in 1989, about 29 years ago, roughly 30 years ago. Stephen Covey, he's actually no longer alive. However, the book is probably, I think it's still a bestseller. So what we're going to do before we get into the 7 habits, there's some preliminary concepts we have to go through a bit so we can be prepared for the 7 habits themselves. So the first preliminary concept is the paradigm shift. You guys have probably saw a picture where if you look at it in a certain way you see an old woman, or if you look at it another way you see a young woman. That picture was popularized by this book, and that's kind of his illustration of the paradigm shift that you have to make to really get into the 7 habits and understand how to use the 7 habits. Kind of sort of be willing to shift your paradigm or your way of looking at the world from where you are looking at it now through a different lens, say, or shifting the lens or shifting the filters on your lens is another way to say it. So when you see a picture in a certain way for, say, a long time, several years, or the way you were born, the way you grew up, the way you were taught, be open to shifting the perspective a bit, and maybe even a lot, so you can see things in either several different ways or in a new way. So that's kind of what paradigm shift is using your imagination to look at something in a different light, from a completely different perspective. Shake up your worldview a bit to kind of look at things anew, shine a different light on it is maybe another way to say it. That's what paradigm shift is. So we're going to be getting into paradigm shifts. Habits. He briefly goes over, what the heck is a habit. So he defines a habit as the intersection of knowledge, skill, and desire. Knowledge is like what to do. Skill is how to do it, and desire is, your heart's desire to actually propel you forward, to actually do a habit. So it's there's different ways of thinking of habits, and that's kind of how he illustrates it. Again, knowledge, skill, desire, the what to do, the how to do, and the fire in the belly to, push through toward the habit, right? He goes through a concept of starting at the bottom, where you don't know the 7 habits, or even a young person, a baby, grow up, or a teenager growing up. So there's a perspective where you start and you spiral up as you learn the 7 habits, from dependence to independence to interdependence. Now that's 3 concepts here. Again, we start with dependence as a child, then we move on to independence as we, say, launch out from high school, college, whatever, and then we become interdependent, which we build ourselves up to the point where we can start giving back to the world. So the process is inside out. He kind of talks a lot about principles and fundamental either laws of the universe or fundamental principles of humanity, or principles of the universe, where it's it's inside out. We don't want to work on the outside going in. We want to have them kind of sort of from the heart coming out. Is kind of his principle of inside out sort of thinking. So work on the inside principles, and as they manifest themselves outwardly is kind of where he's going with the preliminary concepts here. So let's hit the 3 one more time so we can make sure you got it, because this is extremely important, the way he sets up the 7 habits. So again, we start with dependence, where you're dependent upon either your parent or someone external to you to provide for whatever. Dependence. Then you move on to independence, as you're a competent adult taking care of yourself or perhaps your close family. And then once you reach a point where you are abundant in your skill sets and the way you give back to the world, you start contributing to the world and then become interdependent. So interdependent is kind of like, you're dependent Others become dependent on you, like the world or your community or something become dependent on you, and you kind of sort of are interacting with them. So that's an interdependence. So when you start having enough wealth, knowledge, and influence to start giving back, that's your interdependence. Inside out. Okay, good. Effectiveness. So the 7 habits of highly effective people. So we talked about what a habit is. What does effectiveness mean? What does it mean to be effective? His illustration is called the PPC balance. Again, if you are familiar with the 7 habits, you know exactly what this means. But even if you're not, you're going to kind of sort of know what this means, because the 7 habits has been influential in our culture, and it's kind of out there a bit, but sometimes you might not remember or have been educated in the particular terms and what they mean and where they come from. So P and PC balance stands for production versus production capacity balance. His famous illustration is the goose that laid the golden egg, right? So going over the analogy, so you know, the guy has a goose. The goose lays a golden egg every day. The guy gets greedy. He says, "Oh crap! I want to. How can I get more golden eggs? Well, let me kill the goose, open up the goose, and get more eggs." Right? So he, kills the goose, and then suddenly he opens up the goose. There are no eggs. So that illustration, he claims, and the way he uses the illustration is that the production of the goose versus the production capacity of the goose, right? You have to you have to feed the goose and make sure he's alive and can actually produce the golden eggs every day, right? But if you abuse the goose, or in this case, kill the goose, there's no more production capacity. There was so much production without consideration of production capacity that the goose died. Okay, that's his most famous illustration to demonstrate effectiveness. Use what he calls the PPC balance. Again, capacity to produce, or production capacity versus production, right? So another illustration is like your car. You have to maintain your car for it to get the best bang for your buck, right? So let's say you don't maintain your car because you want to get more production out of it. Oh, I don't want to change my oil after 10,000 miles I'm driving. I don't want to stop, because if I stop driving, I won't get to my destination. I won't get paid, or maybe. So you keep on hitting on P, but the maintenance of the car is production capacity. So if you neglect the production capacity and only focus on production, the car is eventually going to blow up. The engine's going to break on you if you don't maintain it, right? Or your tires will fall off or blow out and flip your car, right? So that production versus production capacity balance is important. But if you only, let's say, maintain your car, but you don't use it in a productive fashion, well, then you're wasting your maintenance money, right? So if you only focus on production capacity, it's a waste, right? If you don't eventually start producing. So that's my illustration of the way I take this particular principle, P and PC, kind of sort of. But his illustration is the goose that laid the golden egg. Don't kill the goose, feed the goose, make sure the goose has enough energy and nutrition and environment to produce the golden eggs. And the golden eggs is production. All right? So that's the preliminary. So let's go on to the 7 habits themselves. All right, guys, let's dive into the 7 habits. Let's just list them first, and then we're gonna hit the first one. So habit number 1, be proactive. Habit number 2, begin with the end in mind. Habit number 3, first things first. Habit number 4, think win-win. Habit number 5, seek first to understand, then to be understood. Habit number 6, synergy. And habit number 7, sharpen the saw. All right, let's hit be proactive. Habit number 1. So we should focus on our language here. There's going to be reactive language and reactive language and proactive language. So if you want to understand, sometimes things you understand are opposites. So what is reactive? Okay. Perhaps if you're from, let's say, a working class background, following instructions on the factory floor or whatever, you probably can be a bit reactive sometimes. So that might push some sort of psychology into you that might be reactive. So pay attention to your language. So for example, reactive language. There is nothing I can do. That's just the way I am. He makes me so mad. They won't allow that. I have to do that. I can't. I must. If only. So that's Covey's list of reactive language. So let's go back through the list, and then we're going to hit the reactive language and then switch the language to a proactive language. So number one, there's nothing I can do. Say instead, let's look at the alternatives. So you see that shift? There's nothing I can do versus let's look at the alternatives. Second, that's just the way I am versus I can choose a different approach. See a subtle shift of language where you take responsibility. He makes me so mad versus I control my own feelings. They won't allow that versus I can create an effective presentation. All right? I have to do that versus I will choose an appropriate response. See, the responsibility is coming inside here. I can't versus I choose. I must versus I prefer. If only versus I will. So he also puts an illustration in the book of there's a stimulus and response that animals have, right? So an animal sees something in the wild and then he responds versus human beings. Yeah, we can do the stimulus response thing. So, but that would be animalistic in not taking responsibility. There's a space between stimulus and response with human beings where we choose our response is the theory behind being proactive. Again, stimulus response is kind of reactive. So something happens, boom, I react, versus stimulus, and right between stimulus and response, there's a space to choose your reaction. So stimulus, choice of response. So he uses that illustration in the be proactive section also. So he also uses another extremely important illustration, how you can take better responsibility and increase your effectiveness and influence by focusing on what you can control versus what you can't control. I'm going to go to the diagram here. So he has an illustration of your circle of influence versus your circle of concern. So your circle of influence will typically be smaller than your circle of concern in any case. So your circle of concern is right here, or should I say your circle of concern is this whole thing and circle of influence is within there. So he says, he suggests, if you're in reactive mode, you might be tempted to focus on your circle of concern, something you're concerned with, but the question is, do you have control over that concern? Do you have influence over that concern? Certain people who are into politics, or should I say waste their time in politics, can they truly have influence? Do they have influence? Maybe they do if they got a lot of money, if they have persuasion skills, if they have a method to get into the media or on YouTube or something. Maybe they might have some influence, but probably most of these guys are circle of concern. It's your concern, but you have no power. You have no influence to affect things, right? So that's reactive whenever you're concerned about things you have no control over. Again, being proactive is taking responsibility, stimulus response. So when you respond, are you in control of whatever you're concerned about or not? So he says, always focus on your circle of influence, right? So if you're reactive, your circle of concern will start to contract your circle of influence. If you're messing around with things that you have no control over, eventually you become less and less effective, less influential. So your influence circle will start to contract because you're focusing your energy and wasting your energy because you have no power. However, if you focus on what you have power over, what you can change, where you do have influence, a person that you have influence with, if you focus on your circle of influence, you expand your circle of influence to get bigger and start to shrink your the stuff that you have no power over. So this little gap right here is what you have no power over, but what you might have some concern about, right? Okay, you have no power. So this says if you focus on the circle of influence, you'll expand your circle of influence and make this gap smaller where you have no power, where you have increasing amount of power to affect what you're concerned about. So let's see if I can illustrate. Yeah, I did the illustration with the politics. So focus on what you have influence over, say persons. So if you can't call the president, well, who do you have influence over? Maybe your local city council person, or a local nonprofit organization you have influence over. You can pick up the phone and call somebody, know who you are, or at least know of you. See that? You got influence there, versus trying to contact the president, unless you know the president or you know somebody who knows the president, right? So circle of concern versus circle of influence. So you focus on the circle of influence to expand your power and start affecting a larger portion of your circle of influence with power if you focus on your circle of influence. So again, if you focus on your circle of concern where you don't have any influence or power, it'll eventually contract your actual circle of influence. He calls that being reactive. If you focus on your circle of influence and start expanding it to making your circle of concern where you have no power smaller and smaller, and your circle of influence bigger and bigger, that's being proactive. That's another illustration. All right? That's be proactive. All right, habit number 2, begin with the end in mind. Covey tells you to go to the end, let's say the end of your life as a human being, your funeral. So he says, imagine your funeral and there's 4 people up to talk about you. All right? The first person is a member of your family. The next person is a member of where you worked, where you were employed, your business. The third person to speak about you is one of your friends. And the fourth person to speak about you is a member of your church or your community. So he says, to begin with the end in mind properly is to ask yourself, what would you like each of these people to say about your life? And really, really think about it. You know, what you want these 4 people to say about you at your funeral. It's the end, right? So that's an extreme way of beginning with the end in mind, but ultimately if we want to tune in to something really good, we should probably do this exercise, I think. It'll help out to see where we're going with the 7 habits, specifically the habit number 2, beginning with the end in mind. So he says, are you going to live your life by design or default? Okay. So once you imagine your funeral situation, and you want to know what people at the end is going to say about you, you can start designing your life to where your life will actually produce that end, or as close as possible, right? And that'll be by design, not by default. So let's say a reactive person goes through life by default, let stuff happen to them, okay? Versus a person who wants to design their life, be proactive, right? Habit number 1. And design their life using habit number 2, beginning with the end in mind. Design your life. He says also think about designing a personal mission statement and actually writing out, what are you here on this earth to do, right? And he also illustrates several sectors of how you want to build this personal mission statements within 4 categories in some of his books. I think the 8th habit, body, mind, heart, and spirit. So what do you want to do with your body, i.e. your physical body? What do you want to look like? You want to be healthy. Also money is kind of sort of in the category of body. How do you want to see yourself at your funeral? Your wealth that you leave behind perhaps with your family and friends and kids. Second, mind. How do you want your mind to work? How you want people to understand how you thought, how you reason things out, how you analyze things and put your stuff together logically with facts and stuff. Mind, right? Heart, your relationships. How do you want your relationships to look at your funeral, or how you want them to be remembered, right? Your heart, relationships, people, your family, your friends, your community, all right? The people you work with, how you want these relationships to look. Put that all in your mission statement. Build your mission statement, write out your mission statement, and have all these 4 categories covered. Again, like I said, the third was heart, social, and feelings, of course. What do you want to feel like every day? How do you want to, emotional stability and stuff. How do you want to psychologically feel? And then spirit is meaning, right? What does your life mean? In a broader sense, right? Maybe in a universal sense, in a religious sense, in a philosophical sense. So what does your life mean? And then meaning also points to purpose, right? A lot in philosophy. Meaning, purpose, what's my purpose? Why am I here? And then a personal mission statement captures all 4 of those categories. So he goes over very much detail on how to develop a personal mission statement, with the second habit of beginning with the end in mind. Because if you have a personal mission statement that you're watching or that you're keeping track of, say you read it every week, well, then you know what the end is in mind, right? You're keeping that end always in mind, beginning with the end in mind every day or every week or every month. That's your review, your personal mission statement. He suggests that we be principle-centered and focus on broad ideas like wisdom, security, guidance, and power, and what all these means, but focus on those that are timeless and unchangeable with regard to wisdom, security, guidance, and power, right? Principle-centered is where he's trying to encourage us to go with our personal mission statements. Alternatively, from principle-centered, he says you can be family-focused, money-focused, work-focused, possession-focused, pleasure-focused, friend-enemy sort of dynamic-focused, church-focused perhaps. So these are alternative centers where if you're focused on just family, just money, just work, just possessions, just pleasure, just friends and enemies, just church, well then you're off balance. You're not principle-centered. You are an alternative centered where you're way off balance. You're not an integrated person. You have no integrity. Integrity means you're integrated. Integrity, integrate. You're not integrated. You have no integrity if you're off balance in those ways. So to be integrated, i.e. have integrity, you need to be principle-centered, where you you focus on timeless and unchangeable principles. Visualization, affirmation, roles, and goals. So he shows you how to go from your personal mission statement, and then another category is figure out what your roles are. Say perhaps you're a father, a church member, a professional, a doctor, or whatever, a parent. So that's 4 roles right there. So you have your personal mission statement, then beside that you have your roles, right? Your roles that say those 4 roles, right? Father, church member, doctor, and parent, right? I said parent twice. So your personal mission statement, your roles, and your roles, all these roles drive your goals, right? So whenever you're preparing your month or your week, your goals, you always connect the goals to the roles. Always. So if you have a goal without connect to a role, you're kind of sort of not integrating what you need to integrate. So roles, then your goals, right? So don't do it the other way. Goals first, then roles. So you figure out what your roles are, and then within a category of roles, you develop your goals. So that's another thing he likes you to visualize and develop affirmations on that, based on, again, your personal mission statement as the principle centered, your roles as what are the different things you do as a person, and then your goals all connected together. From goals to roles to personal mission statement, everything's integrated up and down. Integrity, again, the word integrity, integrated, is all integrated. So principle centered, stay away from alternative centers. Are you going to live by design or default, right? Are you going to design your life, or are you just going to let things happen to you by default, right? If you have a personal mission statement, then you're driven to design your life, right? Okay, that's the second habit. All right, habit number 3, first things first. All right. A good question he asks is, what's one thing you can do that you're not doing now, that if you did it on a regular basis, it would make a tremendous positive difference in your life? All right, what's one thing you can do that you're not doing now, that if you did it on a regular basis, it would make a tremendous positive difference in your life? Think about that. Next question is, once you think about that, is why are you not doing it now? Why? All right? And the reason why you're not doing it now is that you're not putting first things first. Right? It's very simple, right? If you were putting first things first, you would be doing everything on a regular basis that would make a tremendous positive difference in your life. That's what you would do if you're putting first things first. Now, there are many reasons why we might not put first things first, right? So he gives us a pretty good, I think it's his best insight, in my opinion, in this particular book, is the quadrant sort of way of looking at first things first and how important things are. So I put the illustration of the quadrants here that he talks about. Actually, there's 3 and 4, so I'm going to add 3 and 4. So if you look at two axes of urgency versus important, and you plot them on a graph, kind of like a spreadsheet, you're going to get 4 quadrants. Those of you who are into spreadsheets, is probably common sense. But so here's important, not important, urgent, not urgent, and we get this matrix here, right? So we want to focus always on important things, right? Okay? If we want to put first things first, okay, then we want to focus on important. And if we want to put first things first, we need to start moving away from the not important stuff, right? Now, something could be important and urgent, or important and not urgent, all right? So his main insight with regard to these 4 quadrants is quadrant 2. So with regard to Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, you're going to hear quadrant 2. So quadrant 2 is important but not urgent, all right? Let's just quickly go over important and urgent so we can differentiate between the two. I'm going to let you, for homework, on your own spare time, go through quadrant 3 and 4 because it's not important, so we won't focus on here. Okay? So, urgent things, activities like crises, pressing problems, deadline-driven projects. Okay, that's urgent and important. We got to do it now. The seduction of urgency somehow, for most of us, will pull you away from important and urgent things, which is quadrant 2, right? So we must, if we want to shift our paradigm, remember the paradigm shift in the introduction, if we want to shift our paradigms to be effective, we need to focus on the important but not urgent quadrant 2. So what is in quadrant 2? Prevention, production capacity activities, increasing your productive capacity, feeding the goose, caring for the goose, all right? Remember the goose that laid the golden eggs? Relationship building, right? Take the time to build relationships. It's not urgent, probably. Very important, extremely important. Recognizing new opportunities, taking the time to reflect. And think about where you're headed, and maybe there are more opportunities out there if you sit back and think about the not urgent stuff. So recognizing these new opportunities is not urgent. All right? So you see where I'm going, or you see where Covey's going with focus on important but not urgent, quadrant 2. Planning and recreation. All right? So how much time you spend planning? How much time you spend in recreation, walking in the park, relationship building with friends, families, colleagues, recreation, sports, how much time you spend on sports, making your body strong, laughing and talking with friends, coffee shop stuff, right? Recreation, how much time you spend there. Again, it's not urgent, but it's extremely important. Recreation, very important, right? You know it's important, but it's not urgent. So we're going to have a seduction to go to quadrant 1. Urgent and important, right? Say ambulance drivers or something like that. Okay? You like the crisis, you like that adrenaline rush. You feel important, when you deal with urgent things, right? But the strategy here is to not be seduced by the urgency and go to the not urgent and important. Stay in quadrant 2. Again, so quadrant 2 is prevention, production capacity, activities, relationship building, recognizing new opportunities, planning and recreation, as opposed to quadrant 1, urgent and important. So urgent and important crises, pressing problems, and deadline-driven projects. The theory here is when you focus on the not urgent and important, this block will shrink. You have less crisis, less adrenaline rush, less frazzled nerves, less stress. Because this is the quadrant of stress, frazzled nerves, right? Overworking, depression, whatever. But if you focus on the not urgent, you'll shrink this quadrant, which is good. You want to expand quadrant 2, and that will shrink quadrant 1. So if you do more planning, relationship building, recognizing opportunities, there'll be less crises, right? Right? You plan to maintain your car, there'll be less failures of the car, less tire blowouts, less engine trouble. All right? The more you look for new opportunities, the more you do planning and recreation, when, say, unemployment hits, you'll be ready. Or you'll see it before it happens, right? You'll be ready for the unemployment if it happens, or business failure, or whatever. Or you might even prevent business failure by looking ahead, planning, recreation, relationship building, seeing what's out there. Stay in the not urgent but important quadrant and watch, be cool in the cool quadrant instead of staying on crisis. And then if you're always in crisis, you can't look ahead, and then suddenly, boom, life hits you, unemployment, business failures, sickness, and you can't deal with it effectively because you're spending too much time in quadrant 1 and not enough time in quadrant 2. Yeah, I guess another big one for quadrant 2 is health, right? So if you're always in a crisis mode, you don't take care of your health, or you're always working 1 million hours a week and not taking care of your relationships and your health, soon the crisis is going to hit you, and you will not be able to deal with them effectively. Again, 7 habits of highly effective people. So you spend time in quadrant 2, and when life hits you, you're ready. Or should I say more ready, right? We all get hit by life, but you'll be more ready the more time you spend in quadrant 2. All right? First things first. That's his most important quadrant. His most important concept in the book is quadrant 2. Roles, goals, schedule, and task list. I think we mentioned this earlier in quadrant 2. Quadrant 3, first things first. Again, I said you have your roles, then your goals, then your schedule, and your task list, right? So for your homework, you can go over that in the 7 Habits book. So he goes over how to structure your personal mission statement, which is habit 2. Going into first things first. First, you review your roles. Father, parent, doctor, church members, for example, and then you define the goals with regard to those roles. And then once you get your goals down, then you put those goals on your schedule and your task list. All right, so and you have an integrated planning system whereby your task list and your schedule is highly, highly integrated with your goals and your roles. That way you keep the fire burning in your heart because it's all connected to your passion, right? And your mission, right? So whenever you don't want to get up in the morning or you're not feeling right, you can still move forward because your schedule and your task list is integrated with your goals, and your goals are integrated with your roles. So there's a big section on habit number 3 on how to connect all those different aspects of planning, right? In delegation, he encourages us to define the resources for whoever you're delegating for, define accountability and consequences. Instead of telling people what to do, we give them goals, guidelines based on their roles, and of course their maturity level, and say, hey, here are the resources, here's accountability when we'll review what happened, and here are the consequences for success or failure, right? Make sure it's all clear. No passive aggressive stuff going on, just, give people the freedom to accomplish whatever the organization's goal is for whatever you're delegating or whatever task you're delegating. All right, so that's quadrant 2, which is heavily, the heaviest concept in the 3rd habit. First things first. Quadrant 2. Quadrant 2 for habit number 3 is kind of funny. So anyway, let's go on to the next one. All right, and we're back. So it looks like we've gone through the first 3 habits of the 7 habits of highly effective people. Now we're going to go into a little intermittent section here to kind of provide a base for the next 3 habits. So Covey divides the habits into mainly 2 categories, with one kind of encompassing them all. So the first category is independence. So the first 3 habits, he refers to it as the process of becoming an independent person. Okay, so once you have the baseline of being an independent person, then you can go to the next level, becoming an interdependent person, where you're giving back to the world or interacting with others, and then it's kind of a symbiosis sort of relationship. So the interdependence is habit 4, 5, and 6. Okay, I kind of put the color codes here: green for independence and red for interdependence, as you're looking at this screen. So he discusses something called a chronic pain versus acute pain. Chronic pain versus acute pain. So in our efforts to go for a quick fix in life, right? Quick fixes are easy in the short term, but they provide us a lot of pain in the long term, right? So quick fixes is referred to as acute pain, very sharp pains, often without addressing the underlying problem. So in one of his illustrations, he refers to this as the Band-Aid approach. So you get this big old sharp pain, and you kind of take an anesthetic or a Band-Aid and cover it up, and you think it's gone, but there's an underlying chronic issue. So acute is like a point in time. Chronic is like something over time. So the chronic thing that goes, the bad stuff that happens over time is not as acute. So you kind of got a tendency not to address the small pains that are happening over a long period of time. But when something acute happens, you want to cover it with a Band-Aid, anesthetic or whatever, alcohol perhaps, in a psychological realm, right? So he wants to make sure we understand the difference between a chronic and acute pain, so we don't have a temptation to go through a quick fix without addressing this underlying chronic issue. Another interesting point he builds very strongly in the book is the emotional bank account. This is probably his second most important insight, aside from the quadrant 2 insight from the previous section. So if you think of your relationship with anybody that's important to you as having an emotional bank account where there are deposits and withdrawals, then you can kind of model on how dysfunctional relationships, eventually reach a breaking point. So if you're making constant deposits into this emotional bank account, this relationship with this other person, when you screw up once or twice, it's like, oh, okay, I know you. I know how you are. It's okay. We know each other. It's nothing. And you get over it. There's a couple of, goofy mistakes you make. But let's say a dysfunctional relationship where there's withdrawals constantly. Eventually you reach a point where there's no more gas in the tank or no more money in the bank, and the relationship explodes and ends, right? So that's his illustration of the human interaction. So he lists several withdrawals from the emotional bank account, and he lists several deposits in the emotional bank account. So let's go over the negative stuff first. That way we can end on a high note. So withdrawals. How do you withdraw from an emotional bank account where you're taking and you're not giving, right? Discourtesy. Sometimes little things are important. Disrespect. Okay. Cutting off. Cutting people off. I don't want to hear that sort of thing, right? Overreacting. A minor issue. You're getting all crazy about it, right? Overreacting. Ignoring. Ignoring people. They don't feel like they're being seen. Okay. Being arbitrary, you're a bit unpredictable and nobody can figure out what you're up to, right? Arbitrary, that's kind of a withdrawal. It actually attacks trust. The next item is betraying trust, right? So someone tells you something in confidence, don't ever repeat it, right? Threatening, like you better, that sort of thing. You better do this or that sort of stuff. So people don't like to be threatened, and that's a withdrawal. I mean, yeah, you might think it works in the short term, but in the long term, it's not gonna pan out very well, right? So let's get to the deposits, the more positive stuff. Let's end on a high note, right? Okay, he says there are 6 major deposits in the emotional bank account. Understanding the individual, sit down and really heart to heart. Do I understand this person? Do I understand where they're coming from? And it's an individual person. I don't categorize them as like, oh, they're that type, no, not a type, individual, that person, right? Attending to the little things, little courtesies. You walk through the door and sometimes you might be too busy and forget the small courtesies, right? And that means a lot, attending to the little things. You're leaving, those courtesies as you're leaving, within your own cultural customs, right? But those things are very important because the little things eventually start adding up, right? Keeping commitments, I'm going to do this, or you can count on me. Keep your folks involved in if there's changes in commitments. And sometimes you have to change commitments, right? But keep them informed if you have to change commitments, right? Or just keep the commitment, right? If you can. Clarifying expectations when people are around you and they don't know what to expect from you, that's a problem. But the deposit in the emotional bank account is clarifying, hey, this is what I need, this is what I want, you're getting what you need, right? Let's see if you're getting what you need. I'm getting what I need, I think, but this is what I need, clarifying that stuff, right? There's this exchange, in relationships, clarifying expectations. Showing personal integrity. I like the way the best illustration of integrity that I know of is integrity goes toward the concept of integration, where you bring all the aspects of a situation and integrate them properly in proportion. Some people might like the word balance, but I like the word proportion. So integrity is integration, proper integration of the several elements of any relationship, situation, personal life, or whatever. Showing personal integrity. The final major deposit he mentions is apologizing sincerely when you make a withdrawal. Okay, let me just repeat that. Apologizing sincerely when you make a withdrawal. So there's, the blow-off apology, just like I said, the quick fix apology versus the sincere one, right? So there's a big difference there. And of course, apologizing sincerely, we can also, those of you who are red pill, there's a way to apologize where you actually appear weak, right? You're oh my God, I'm so sorry. Like you feel like a weak person, and you're apologizing so someone doesn't hurt you, not because you mean it sincerely. So that's kind of, if those of you who are red pill, that's a blue pill apology where you're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. No, that's not an apology. That's not sincere, right? There's the insincere where you're, you don't care, where it's like, I'm better than you. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. And there's the blue pill sort of apology. Oh my God, please don't, hurt me and stuff. So that's the blue pill. We don't want to be blue pill. We want to be red pill, apologizing sincerely, where you come from a position of strength and you actually mean it. But you're not begging, sort of thing. You're not coming from a position of weakness or overbearing intimidation, right? You're kind of doing that middle sort of mean between the two extremes, where you come across as a competent person, but not as an overbearing, lording things over people, or becoming from a inferior, a begging slave sort of position, right? Not a master or a slave, right? Competent person. It's another way to say it, using Nietzschean terms, right? He goes over the laws of love and the laws of life. He says it's probably a good idea for us to come from a position of the laws of life and the laws of love, as opposed to quick fixes and stuff. Come from a principled center. It's kind of what he typically goes toward whenever he uses his language, sort of stuff. Principle-centered leadership, you'll hear Covey saying, or the center of things, the divine center, or whatever. So, in other words, timeless principles. He's kind of referring to it here. Final note, P and PC, remember this: production and production capacity. Goose laying the golden eggs, you got to feed the goose. Production is the golden eggs, PC is feeding the goose, tending to the goose, right? The illustration he uses. So he says whenever we move towards interdependence with other people, where you're giving back and you're actually contributing into a group, production problems of production are actually production capacity opportunities, okay? So if there's an issue where you're not getting enough production from whatever process or business or relationship that's going on, it's an opportunity to work on production capacity, so you increase production over the long term, right? So he wants to make sure those preliminaries are taken care of before we get into the actual laws themselves. So these are preliminaries. So we'll get to the actual laws in the next section. All right, let's get into habit number 4. Think win-win. Think win-win. Covey has illustration that I think is a pretty good tool to use as to how to approach the win-win paradigm. I mean, if you're from a dysfunctional environment, this is going to be a paradigm shift, right? Instead of looking at the world through a lens of I win, you lose, then you look through a lens of we're both going to win here together, right? So he builds an illustration called the courage versus consideration matrix. You'll see in his book. And I've redrawn it right here so you can see what it is. So on the consideration axis, there's low consideration going towards high consideration. On the courage axis, there's low courage going towards higher courage this way, right? So if you have a case of not much consideration and not much courage in a negotiated agreement, then you might get something called lose-lose. Both sides lose because they don't have the fortitude or courage, and they don't have consideration of the other side, right? Consideration of the party across the table, right? So that's lose-lose. If you have high courage and low consideration, well, then you're going to go for a win, and you don't care if the other side loses. So, okay, a lot of courage, fortitude, low consideration, then you might go for win-lose. If you have high consideration and low courage, you might call this blue pill, high consideration of the other person and not much courage for your stuff, right? You might go for a lose-win, where you lose and the other guy wins, right? All right, the blue pill thing, huh? All right. But if you have equal consideration and equal courage, or should I say high consideration or high courage, then you can go for a win-win solution where you're taking into consideration your interests and the interests of the other guy across the table, right? So that's how you do win-win. High courage. You got to know what you want. Again, personal mission statement, maybe a corporate mission statement, maybe a business mission statement, and you kind of sort of know what the mission of the other guy across the table is, right? So you get this courage and consideration thing that's very high, and you go for that win-win solution, right? He brings up a few other concepts called the abundance mentality. So if you're in a dysfunctional relationship, business, personal, whatever, you might have a thought process, well, if I have this, or if I get this in the relationship, business, whatever, that means there's less for others, right? Less for the other side, right? Where the abundance mentality assumes there's enough for all of us to go around, right? There's just a lot on the table. We have so much to offer in this trade agreements or whatever. That's a core concept within the 7 habits, is the abundance mentality. Again, let's go over that again, because this is kind of important. So if you don't have the abundance mentality, you say, oh, if he gets that, well, then I'm going to be left without, right? Okay, you see that? Or if I get this, it means he loses, right? Again, win-lose, lose-win. The abundance mentality says, hey, we really use our creativity here, and we negotiate with high courage and consideration. We can both win. There's enough for everyone in a negotiated agreement. Abundance mentality. He also goes over several pieces that contribute to the win-win mentality. Relationships have to be integrated with character, have to be integrated with agreements, such as performance agreements. If it's a business, you want to have win-win management training, i.e., let's make sure that we're all playing by the same rules here in our business relationships, which would require win-win management training, right? Win-win performance agreement. So if you have people working for you or with you, if there's some sort of either informal or formal agreements, let's make it win-win, systems and processes. So in order for win-win to really work, you probably need your systems and processes to support it. Otherwise, the individuals are going to be working against the system, and that's usually a losing proposition when you're working against the system and you don't have enough power to affect the systems and the processes. So he's going toward the idea that the character of the person, which somewhat involves the maturity and the abundance mentality of the person, should be integrated with these relationships, right? The relationships, abundance mentality, axis of maturity, was courage versus consideration. This is kind of sort of what he would refer to in some cases as the maturity axis. So that has to be integrated with agreements, win-win management training if we're in a business situation, or if it's a family or a personal relationship, the understanding, the informal understanding, hey, are you feel like you're getting what you need out of here? I think I might not be getting what I need, but let's talk about this. Let's see if we can, push through and come to a win-win agreement. It's a personal relationship, right? And you don't have to use that language. You just have to make sure that's the mindset, right? It's like below the neck sort of thing. It's like win-win is sometimes not right here. It could be, are we feeling like we're both winning, right? Make sure the systems and the processes, if you're in a business sort of situation, that it's supporting the win-win mindset. All right, that's the end of win-win. All right, habit number 5 of the 7 habits. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. In other words, you influence others by first being influenced yourself. Again, this is probably more appropriate in a win-win situation. So if you're in a dysfunctional situation, this might not be appropriate. But seek first to understand, then to be understood. Even if it is dysfunction, you might give it a shot and see if it works, right? So he goes and discusses the importance of character, communication, emphatic listening, diagnose, then prescribe, understanding and perceptions, then to be understood, and then the one-on-one sort of stuff. So character and communication. So actually in the 8th habit, his next popular book, he defines character as a combination of trust and competence. So trust is kind of like, can you trust that person? I.e., are they motivated to do the right thing? And incompetence, are they actually skilled in what you're interacting with them with? So that's kind of what he refers to as character, trust, and competence. Communication, extremely important. First, seek to understand and to be understood. I think he also has something called the Indian talking stick illustration in the book, whereby there's some sort of a prop that you pass around a table, and the person who has the prop, i.e. the Indian talking stick, won't pass it to the next person until he feels like, or she feels like, she's understood. So the person who has a stick presents their case and makes sure everyone around the table understands them in their own words, right? And then once they feel understood, then they pass the Indian talking stick to the next person. So that's one illustration he uses in the book, which is a prop that might be quite useful if you're in a team building sort of a situation where you want to kind of illustrate the goodness of the seek first to understand and to be understood. Emphatic listening. And again, the Indian talking stick illustration is kind of like emphatic listening. So you don't necessarily want to have someone repeat to you what you just told them. You want them to repeat your concepts in their own words, and you want to feel that their own words describe what you're talking about, but it may be a different set of language, right? Okay, so they're not mirroring you or parroting you, they're reinterpreting it with their own language patterns and their own style, and you say, oh yeah, that's what I mean, and you hear it from another person from another perspective, your own concepts, and you say, yes, that's what I mean. So that's the emphatic listening, is that there's this feedback loop where you present and then you get the feedback and you say, yes, that's what I mean, right? Diagnose before you prescribe. So you might come across as a bit presumptuous if you start prescribing solutions without carefully diagnosing the problem, right? So typically, you go to a doctor, you're going to be after him to diagnose, right, before he starts prescribing pain meds or antibiotics, right? He needs to take a look at your symptoms, diagnosis, and then treatment. So diagnose before you prescribe. And again, that's getting the emotional bank account stuff in line again, and this is, again, understanding, but some of this is emotional bank account, where if you prescribe before it's diagnosed, it's kind of a withdrawal. People's like, where are you coming from, right? He goes and illustrates 4 autobiographical responses. We're not going to get into that here, but he makes the point that a lot of us in short-circuiting communications or going for the quick fix, we read from our own autobiography. Well, when I was your age, I used to do this, and this, and that's why you need to do this. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of treating someone like a child a bit, when in fact they're a mature adult, right? Reading from your own autobiography in a way that kind of treats someone else like a child. Oh, I've done this before, so here's how it has to happen, because I did it before. And you kind of like putting that forth without getting that, presentation and then the feedback. And then if they don't really catch what you're saying, you got to present it again to get the feedback against feedback loop, right? Quality of your communication is the feedback you receive, is another way of saying it from the NLP traditions. Understanding and perception. So again, as we put forth our presentation and receive the response and seeing if people understand what we're saying, there's understanding and perception issues you got to be attuned to, because sometimes people can really understand you, but they use different language patterns and they come from a different perspective. If you ever did the Myers-Briggs personality profiles, in introverts versus extroverts, intuitives versus sensory, feeling versus thinking, and then perceivers versus judgers. So you're going to have those categories, or perhaps other categories where people are coming at your own idea and presenting it back to you from their perspective. And it's correct, right? But it's just from their language patterns and their perspective. So there's issues of understanding and perception. You have to make sure you close the loop, right? Then seek to be understood. right? First you understand, then you seek to be understood. So this is like a give and take sort of thing as you pass the Indian talking stick around and do this feedback response. It goes both ways, right? You have to understand, and then you have to be understood. It's kind of like this win-win thing, right? Kind of, sort of, right? It's another spin-off of win-win. One-on-one. A good deposit in an emotional bank account is a one-on-one conversation. Sometimes things are inappropriate in group settings, right? And if you know how to lead in any organization, you're going to know that one effective method of persuasion and influence is to have the meeting before the meeting. Okay, so let's say you have a meeting with 5 to 8 people next week. Well, and then in the days before the meeting, you're going to want to do one-on-one informal talks with some of maybe the main decision makers if you can. And that's a trick in influence, not a trick, but it's a method of influence that many leaders know very well, and then those who are not leaders might not know this, and then they get into a meeting and it's a struggle to influence when in fact they probably could have just took a little bit of time and do this one-on-one thing and then work on the seek to understand and then be understood in a one-on-one setting. That way when you get in a meeting, everybody has a better rapport in the meeting. The big meeting usually goes by a bit smoother. So just pay attention to that one-on-one thing if you consider yourself a leader or if you've ever been in a leadership position. All right, guys, habit number 6 of the 7 habits of highly effective people. Okay, habit number 6 is synergize. You're going to hear a lot of stuff in here, and it kind of sort of approaches what we might call magical or mystical or something like that, but we're reaching out toward a higher level of thinking in a group where it's not... there's a snowball effect that starts to happen where one idea builds upon another idea, and suddenly it gets this big machine process going and everybody just gets energized in the interaction, and people start learning on the spot, start getting insights on the spot, getting creative on the spot, and it raises the level of energy within the group. So you're going to kind of sort of get that sense in the 6th habit called Synergize. The principles of creative cooperation. So an idea to think about in terms of synergy to keep in mind is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So each of us, say individually, bringing our ideas to the table. Let's say that just putting it on the table, like I say at the start of the meeting, okay, the whole is equal to the sum of its parts. When the meeting gets cranked up and everybody starts jumping off of another person's idea and a creative insight starts jumping up and stirring up the snowball effect of creativity and insights, the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts as this meeting or as this ritual starts gaining momentum. The relationship the parts have to each other is mostly catalytic. So if you remember your chemistry, a catalyst is something that increases the speed of a chemical reaction, right? The more empowering, the more unifying, and the more exciting part, right? Creative process is also the most terrifying part. So you see a lot of people that, or should I say a lot of organizations that might be a bit scared of this, and watch out for those organizations that are scared of synergy, because they probably won't be around long. Because in order to take your organization or your company to the next step, and you're scared of this sort of stuff, you'll wither on the vine. You will. You'll die. So the creative process is sometimes terrifying because the question comes up during these synergistic meetings is, what will happen? Well, you don't know. Where will it go? You don't know. That's the fun about it, right? New challenges and new dangers will be identified. And that's what kind of builds the energy, right? You know, voltage, differences in voltage creates a separation between charges, and that increases current, right? The flow of energy, flow of power, right? New challenges, new dangers. There's a sense of adventure, discovery, and I said creativity. You must leave your comfort zone to be involved in synergy or synergizing sort of meetings. Those who are a bit dysfunctional and scared types probably won't find this to be a good thing, they'll probably avoid it. But you have to be adventurous, kind of like to discover new things, be a creative type. You know, when I say creative type, I mean you're not afraid of coming up with new insights right now. You don't have to be prepared, because those who like to be extremely prepared before a meeting probably won't. They'll kind of freak out on this stuff. So you got to just leave that preparedness going. Yeah, you can prepare, but don't be prepared to present something formal. Be prepared to contribute and bring some life to the meeting, right? Another word you'll see with regard to synergy and synergizing is trailblazer. We're starting something new here. Let's go after something that we have never done and just plot out what it looks like, right? Trailblazer. Pathfinder, another way to say, you know, trailblazer. New territories is another way to say it, you know. We haven't looked at this yet. Let's go there and see what happens, right? New continents, he also puts in there, Stephen Covey. So next section is synergistic communication. So you have to approach this with an open mind and open heart in expressing expressions of new possibilities, new alternatives, and new options, all right? So again, not just an open mind, you have to have the open heart where you bring both the mind and the heart together and to the table, into the meeting, and just let the ideas flow and see new things, right? See new things you haven't seen before, see trails, pathways you haven't seen before. Everybody gains more insight. There's the excitement of mutual learning, creating momentum to move forward with more and more insights. Again, this is kind of what I was saying, the snowball effect, whenever the synergy really kicks in and the heart and mind come together and the snowball starts happening. More insights, learning, and growth. He has some examples of synergy in the classroom because he was a teacher for a while. Classroom, and we're going to hit business also. So in the classroom, it's almost as if the group agrees to subordinate the old scripts and write a new one. So let's say you're coming into a classroom with a set curriculum. Well, let's jazz things up and change things around. If we can have a synergistic meeting and come up with something even better than the old script, you know, using the old script as the baseline, but then synergize and create a new script. You know, that's one way of doing a classroom synergy session, right? You might have an example of, say, one person might begin to relate some very powerful personal experiences, both emotional and insightful. Then, you know, sometimes you might see humility and reverence fall upon the class as this person shares this stuff, and appreciation for the courage to put it forth, right? In heart and mind, bring forth, put it on the table. Courage, right? You know, that takes a bit of courage or fortitude. Creation or the cultivation of a fertile soil for the synergistic and creative endeavor. Others start picking up on it, right? Some guy or girl puts this courage forth with these experiences, mind and heart. Others start picking up on it, and others start sharing their experiences and their insights, right? And then even sharing self-doubts. Again, that's where the courage thing comes in, right? Self-doubt. Who wants to put that on the table unless you have the courage, right? There comes a spirit of trust and safety prompted. It'll prompt many to become extremely open. So once, if it's a functional environment, i.e. not a dysfunctional environment, an environment of trust and safety among the group, then people are more extremely open to put stuff on the table and build the snowball effect, jumping on top of people's ideas and piggybacking on ideas. Feed on each other's insights and ideas. Create a new scenario as to what the class could mean, okay? So he had a synergistic instance in the book you can read about. There's something magical, like I said before, magical, creative, loosening, sensing new possibilities, maturity, stability, substance, and you transcend the old structure and plan, okay? So that's kind of the feeling. Again, we're talking more mystical on this. It's kind of, we're approaching an energy level where there's a union of heart and mind, and it's a bit more mystical instead of oh, this is what it looks like, this is what it looks like. More, this is what it feels like, and this is kind of how it should be going, right? How it feels like, how it might look, and how it should be going. So we've got a sense of momentum here, right? Synergy in business. All right. Thinking out loud. Okay, I actually say that term a lot myself when I'm speaking to my colleagues. Let's think out loud. Okay, well, by the way, on the phone, thinking out loud, let's see if we can do this, this, and this, and just like throwing stuff on a mental whiteboard on the telephone, thinking out loud, right? And then as you draw the conversation to action points, then you call all the ideas that you threw on the virtual whiteboard. Collective free association, right? So I said there's this spontaneous piggybacking of ideas. So free association is an old term from Sigmund Freud, whereby you take a session of a patient and you start with one word and you allow the patient to free associate everything that comes to their mind that's based on this one word or idea. Excuse me, one word or idea, and free associate. So you'll see some of this sometimes in a synergistic session where free association happens, where someone puts forth an idea, another person free associates upon that idea, creates maybe 10 or 12 other ideas around that, and then somebody else will continue that snowball effect or the free association effect around the other ideas. And so this creates a big pile of energy that just goes and goes and goes, and it feels good, feels really good. Synergy and communication. Yeah, here we go, communication. So in order for synergy to really happen, the sense of safety and comfort, or should I say safety, where someone can put forth their self-doubts or put forth and encourage the emotional sort of element to it, in addition to the intellectual element, you gotta have a high emotional bank account, right? We spoke about that in the previous section. So if you have a very low trust culture, this probably won't happen. But if you have a high emotional bank account where there's a lot of trust going on there, then this can happen, right? So you have to create the conditions of trust with a high emotional bank account for synergy to happen. It just won't just happen with a dysfunctional environment. In fact, it's the exact opposite of a dysfunctional environment. Dysfunctional environment is kind of dead, whereas a synergistic environment is growing. So you have to keep a lot of this stuff in mind. He has a graph in there which you can take a look at in the book closer, but I just did a quick one. Where there's an axis of increasing trust on this axis and increasing cooperation on this axis. He says if there's low trust and low cooperation in a session, then you get a defensive sort of dysfunctional atmosphere in the meeting or in the session, right? If there's a little bit of trust and a little bit of cooperation, well, then you get a respectful. But we're still not there yet, right? We're not quite there yet, with a little bit of trust and a little bit of cooperation. So if you focus on the emotional bank account in your company culture or your family, whatever session this is happening in, increase that emotional bank account where there's a lot of trust and a lot of cooperation, and then you'll be able to create the conditions of synergy. So this is another graph to kind of help you see the preconditions or the environment necessary to create synergy. High trust, high cooperation. All right, now fishing for the third alternative. You might have heard this in perhaps pop culture or in the media or somewhere, the third alternative, and now we're going to show you exactly what it means. So let's say you're in a situation, maybe perhaps slightly dysfunctional, where you're butting heads with two incompatible plans, and you can't make headway because one person has one position, the other person has another position. They're incompatible, and one of them has to win or lose, or one person or the other has to win or lose, and the other person has to lose, right? Or there's just no deal, right? So whenever you creatively work on a third alternative, this is where synergy really makes its worth very valuable. If there's a high emotional bank account and you're in a synergistic situation where there's two people that come together with two incompatible plans, this creative process, this creative session can create a third alternative that's higher than a 2. where you're butting heads. And usually the third alternative integrates aspects of value of both parties to where both parties can agree. And we're, again, talking about win-win, right? So it's not like, I win, he loses, he wins, I lose. It's like we're both going to work on this synergistically where we create a third alternative where we both win, right? See what that is? So that's fishing for the third alternative. So that's, I guess, third alternatives is another way to get out of the win-lose situation, or lose-lose, or perhaps even compromise. So this is not compromise. Compromise is when you trade off losses and wins to come to some agreement. No, win-win is not compromise. Win-win is where both feel like I won, he won, right? Whereas compromise is like, yeah, we didn't get all we want, but it's the best we can have, right? See, there's a big difference. Compromise is, oh, we settled for what we could get. Win-win is like, we're stayed at it. We did the synergy. We did the emotional bank accounts over a few weeks or a few days, and we really worked at this synergistically. We got a third alternative. We won. We finally got an agreement where we really both love it. We like it. It's synergistic, right? So you're going to get that sort of result feeling feedback from a true synergistic session where you hash out and you just work on, and suddenly the third alternative emerges and everybody's happy. That's one of the biggest values of synergy, is this third alternative. He also discusses several other subjects which you can read in the book. There's something called negative synergy in, say, dysfunctional situations to watch out for. Valuing differences. There's this respectful sort of way of seeing the other party in a synergistic manner where, you see differences, but you're not trying to butt heads or fight with the difference. You're trying to flesh out the value proposition in a synergistic fashion to feel through what's going to be a win for both parties. Force field analysis. He talks about that also. What's preventing you from getting what you want, what's stopping you, and what's pushing you toward getting what you want, to kind of flesh out, what are the individual elements that's helping you get towards your goal? What's the individual elements that's stopping you from getting you from your goal? Force field analysis. He also uses illustrations from nature. Nature is synergistic, where life forms build upon each other, and there's this big ecosystem where all is more wealthy as a result of the cooperation and synergy. Whereas if there's a single individual out there, he doesn't have this access to the ecosystem where everybody's wealthier in an upward spiral of value. He's just out there on his own, right? So nature synergistic. He kind of does a few illustrations there. All right, now for habits number 7, the final habit of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. Sharpen the saw is habit 7. So he has an illustration in there where he says there's a bunch of guys out in the wilderness sawing down trees, and one guy notices that the saw is getting a bit dull, and he says, well, let's stop here and sharpen the saw. And the other guy says, no, we got to get all these trees done. If we stop and sharpen the saw, we'll lose time, okay? And whenever you think about that little conversation, you're like, well, that's absurd. If you don't sharpen the saw, eventually you'll either break the saw or you won't be able to saw at all, right? So sharpening the saw is kind of sort of taking care of the tools of our body, mind, heart, and spirit, as he calls it in the 8th habit. So the principles of balanced self-renewal that he refers to, there's 4 dimensions that he works on specifically for the renewal efforts. If you've read the 8th habit, you'll recognize these quickly, body, mind, heart, spirit. So the first focus is physical, your physical body, physical objects, tools or whatever. Taking care of the body, what you put into your body, how you exercise your body, take care of your muscles, make sure it's well oiled, as it were, or well fit for the job, right? Then the second dimension is mental. Are you keeping your mind sharp? Are you studying your profession? Are you studying other professions? Are you staying creative? Are you reading books? How many books per month you read that are new? that are outside of your field, right? There's books you have to read in your field, or should I say, keeping up with the information in your field, YouTube videos, whatever. But as also, you need to expand yourself to keep the creative juices flowing. You need to check out information that's not in your field. Mental, and this is the mental dimension. Social emotional is the fourth dimension of renewal. So social and emotion, right? There's something called psychological housekeeping, right? Am I becoming a bit too angry this past month, or am I being a bit too depressed this past month? Or are some of the negative emotions a little bit too much? Well, then I have to start doing some psychological hygiene sort of things. That's the emotional thing, right? That's the heart. Okay, you need to take care of your psyche, right? Your emotions. The other element is social, which is still the heart effect. So your social, are you going out for coffee with your neighbors, your family, your friends? Or are you not doing that enough? Are you renewing those relationships with your colleagues? Are you going out to lunch with them? Are you having heart-to-heart conversations with your family, friends, colleagues? Social, right? Are you tending to your relationships, right? That's sharpening the saw. So sharpening the saw in the social emotional dimensions is taking care of your emotions, your psyche, whatever goes on in there inside of you, for more positive, refreshing, life-giving sort of emotions, to make sure you have more days of that than the bad emotions, right? And the social thing, make sure you sharpen the saw of your relationships with your family, friends, colleagues, right? That could take many forms. So how do you sharpen those saws, right? And then the fourth is spiritual. So meaning. So how do we derive meaning in our lives? A lot of us, perhaps, or members of religious organizations, some people have meditative techniques whereby you refresh your spirituality using meditation, yoga, prayer, sometimes fasting, exercise. Sometimes weightlifting and cardio is not only connected to the physical. Sometimes that's connected to spiritual. It kind of sets a ritual whereby you're focused on the reps, or you're focused on the oxygen for the cardio, or the weightlifting energizes you, and your mind gets renewed with the meaning inherent in that ritual, right? Because a lot of the spiritual is ritualizing something, and as you ritualize this thing, it somehow renews you and enlightens you in some way by either focus or unfocus, or the combination of focus and unfocus if you're into meditation or yoga, right? So, and whenever you're involved in spiritual practices, we're not so much intellectual spiritual. We're not talking about just theology. We're talking about, again, below the neck. I use that illustration a lot, the below the neck stuff. So your rituals, how do you walk through either a liturgy, church service? How do you walk through it? Is that feeding the spiritual meaning of your life? As you do your yoga, is that kinesthetic feeding your spirituality? As you do meditation, focus upon your meditation, or unfocus, depending on how you do it, is that giving you spiritual meaning, right? So that's the fourth dimension, is spiritual. So again, in summary, in the eighth habit, he says body, mind, heart, spirit, for those four dimensions. The body, the mind, the heart, and the spirit is kind of symbols for the four dimensions. But abstractly, it's physical, mental, social, emotional, and spiritual. So those are the four dimensions of renewal. So we need to renew ourselves on those four dimensions periodically. Put that on schedule. And in fact, that's one of the big rocks, and say first things first. The third habit, remember, priorities. So the renewal of these four dimensions, that needs to be a priority on your schedule. There's really no way to get around it. If you're going to be a successful or an effective person, you have to renew those four dimensions of life, right? Okay.